Hey guys, Jen here. Running a little late today. I was actually up really late last night working on a project for a client and then working on, making sure I was reading through. All right. Just gonna take a couple more seconds to get everything situated for the live stream. If you're here, say hi so that I know you're here. And I think Larry's gonna be back with us at some point today too, which is awesome. So today is our fourth discussion in the story engineering series. And today's a real good one because we're talking about structure, or we're leading into talking about structure tomorrow officially, but today we're talking about the things that go along with structure. So it's going to give everyone a couple of minutes to join while I continue situating all of this stuff. So let's see. And hopefully my dog will be quieter today. He is hanging out with me, but I don't think he's as upset as he was yesterday. All right. All right, well, welcome. And I'm going to just jump in because, like I said, I like to sort of just keep these short if I can. They haven't really been that short, but I definitely like them all to be, just as valuable as possible. So jumping in, talking about structure. For anyone who is new to this series, who's just joining us, this is what we are talking about, Story Engineering by Larry Brooks. I know the image is backwards. Unfortunately, I have no control over that. That is a Facebook thing. So Story Engineering, get yourself a copy if you don't already have one. We have been talking this week all about the core competencies, the most important pieces of structure or important pieces of craft that you need in order to build a really good story. And today we're talking about structure specifically, which is, in my opinion, the most important of the core competencies, because I just believe that you could have all of the rest of them down, but if you don't have structure, you still don't have a story. So, just to sort of dive into this, discussion and this conversation, something that Larry talked about in story engineering that I thought, is super important. And it's the idea of structure being story. So a lot of times, and we talked about this in the first live stream earlier this week, the idea of story being, representative of a lot of different things. So a lot of times people will say story is conflict, or it's character, or story is a journey, or it's the watching a hero become, watching an ordinary person become heroic. And all of that is totally true. It's just not the full definition of story. So I always say the definition of story is opposition, and Larry also says that in his book. And I think that's obviously a key point because structure plays into opposition being a part of the whole picture. So the thing that Larry talked about, and I quoted it here, is that he says, story is what turns conflict into dramatic tension. So it's really that taking of what you have, going on in the story and actually turning it from not just conflict about a character's life, but actually an opposition, an antagonist, a bad guy who's going to oppose this character and give them stakes, give them a mission and a journey to go on over the course of the story. So that's what he means by saying it turns conflict into dramatic tension, because you can't have dramatic tension without some sort of an opposition at play, because otherwise it's just conflict, and conflict is okay, but it's not enough. It's not, enough to make it an actual story. So something that I see a lot with the writers that I work with, and with, writers that I just see out there in the world, working on their stories and sharing stuff in Facebook groups and things like that. And I find that the most important thing that they're lacking in their stories is structure. So they may have a grasp on some of the other stuff. They may actually have really, really great prose. So like they can write really amazing words. Their description is great. Their characterization is great, but they don't actually have a story because they don't have any structure. So that's a really important distinction, I think, to see. Oh, Larry's on. Hi. How are you? Hopefully you had good travels yesterday. Hi, Janet. Welcome to the live stream. Okay, so, and Larry talked about this in story engineering, saying that the most common shortcoming of unpublished writing is the lack of a solid grasp on storytelling. And that's why I say that it's so important to master craft, to, study it as much as you can, pay attention to how stories unfold in the movies and books, and really take the time to develop your idea into an actual story that has all of these core competencies. It covers all of these pieces, because without that, you're not going to have that grasp on storytelling that you need to get your stuff published. And even if you're publishing yourself, it's even more important to have this. And the reason is because a self-published book already comes with the stigma of it's not good enough. Self-publishing, isn't as professional as traditionally published books. And so in order to overcome all of that, you have to do a professional job on your book. And so storytelling is going to be a huge piece of that. And I think if you do nothing else, study as much story as you can, watch how they unfold in movies, read books as much as you can, and just practice with your own writing, because that's the thing that's going to cause you to finally understand how storytelling really works. And it will be the difference between a book that gets published and a book that doesn't. And so I always say you can have the most beautiful prose in the world, but if you don't know how to tell a story, it doesn't matter. Great prose is not going to get you where you want to go. It will get you to a place that, maybe makes you a little bit better than some of the other stories out there. But without having an actual story, all that beautiful prose doesn't really matter. So what I like to say is, even if you're not that great of a prose writer, which I don't consider myself to be the greatest prose writer in the world, it's something that I'm working on. And obviously, as I write more stories, I feel like I get better and better at it. But I don't think I'm that great of a prose writer yet. But what I do think I'm really, really good at is telling stories. And as, taking this idea and really turning it into something that makes you want to go on this journey with this character. And because I've studied storytelling so much and I've learned so much about it, I now feel that helps me to stand out from other stories, even if my prose isn't the greatest. So the whole thing I say is, if you know how to tell a good story, you can learn how to write better prose. You can take your revision, time during your storytelling and actually use that to create better prose, working the story over again, not necessarily changing the story, but changing the way you're writing it and changing the, wording, making sure that it's flowing better, that you're not using all kinds of adverbs and things like that. But none of that matters if you don't have a story. And so that's why this section is so important. And that's why we're going to dive in right now and talk about the specifics of building a story structure. And Larry, feel free to chime in at any point when you've got something else to add to what I'm saying. Let's see. Corey says, it blows me away the authors figure out proper structure without either being film majors or reading Larry's books. I would be lost. It's a wonder how they do it without going nuts. Yeah, I think they probably somehow just managed to intuitively pick it up maybe while they were reading books or watching a lot of movies. But the thing is, and I talked about this the other day, but it doesn't help you out to intuitively know how to do a story if you can't explain how you did it. And the reason because I say that is because you could do it once, let's say accidentally, maybe you have this intuitive story sense and you maybe make a story work, but then you try to do it again and it's like, well, shit, what did I do the first time? I don't know. So there's actually a disconnect, I think, that comes from being able to execute, but not being able to explain how you did it, versus there is a really big power in being able to not only execute, but to understand how to explain it so that someone else could see how you did it and really understand it. So there was actually an article in Writer's Digest, and Larry talked about this on his blog a few months ago. There was an interview with this best-selling author who's sold millions of books, and her newest book was being turned into a movie. And she couldn't tell in the interview, she couldn't tell you how she got where she was at. She sort of just, she said, I think I just got lucky. I think that, I just finally stumbled upon the right story. That wasn't any of it. She had an intuitive sense of story. She just didn't know how to explain it. And that's a really not a good thing, I don't think, because you have to understand your craft and you have to be able to really, explain it and be able to understand how it works. Because when you do that, then you can really have the edge, because then you're able to, take all this information that you have about a story and use it in a way that not only comes to life, but then you can replicate it over and over again without going back to the drawing board each time and being like, all right, how did I do this last time? I don't know. So there's a disconnect there. And I think it's really important that, you learn craft and that you study it and you can actually explain what you're doing. Larry says, many best-selling authors love to say they don't know how they did it. It's either false hubris or a sad truth. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And again, that's why I think it's important to know both, because if you can understand a story and how to explain it, and you know how you've done this in your own story, it just makes you have a much better power for the next story that you write, because you've got everything in place that you need to know, and you know what has to be there, where it has to go, and all of that. Larry says, in this month's Writer's Digest, there is an article advising relative to structure to trust your gut instinct. Risky advice if your gut isn't fully informed. Exactly. Exactly. So when people say they sit down and they write their stories intuitively, oh, I just sit down and start writing. That's fine, but I guarantee 99% of the time they're not ending up with an actual story. They're ending up with a version of a discovery of a story or the process of trying to find a story, but they're not ending up with a complete story. Unless they're like Stephen King or someone like that. In that case, his intuitive sense is so developed that he can sit down and start writing without thinking about this stuff ahead of time too much. But the worst part is when he advises people to go and do that, because it doesn't work. You have to be able to understand how a story goes together. So, and Larry just said, works for Stephen King, sure, but do we know what King knows? Yeah, exactly. And so this section is super important. If you pay attention to no other live stream in this series, this one and the one tomorrow is going to change everything for you. So I wrote my very first novel in 2008, had no clue what I was doing, just sat down and wrote it by the seat of my pants, kept getting stuck because I wasn't sure where to go next. And so I ended up having all these random scenes where my character is crying or drinking or hanging out in a bar or eating at a restaurant, but nothing actually moved the story forward or added to the story. There was no plot really. And even though I had a sort of plot in there, all those weird scenes that didn't actually build the story were taking away from that plot that I had going on. So it was a huge, huge problem for me. And when I started revising it and going, writing the first version again and going, okay, this is not working still, and then working on it again, and just feeling like I can't keep rewriting this story. I just kept feeling like there was something missing, and I didn't know what it was. I was, very familiar with fiction writing as far as and Larry talked about this in story engineering, that there are so many classes and books and workshops out there that teach you all these other pieces of story, voice and how to write a really good scene and, how to describe things and how to have characterization. And all of that is important and a really big part of it. But without the structure, you don't have a story, because structure is what makes it a story. Otherwise, it's an episodic narrative of a character's day-to-day life. And yeah, it might have conflict or drama, but it doesn't have structure. And structure is what keeps a reader hooked. It keeps them wanting to watch the movie or wanting them to read the story and see what happens. So finally, I gave up in 2008. I gave up on that story and said, not that I gave up, but I said, I'm setting this aside. There's something missing. I don't know what it is yet. And I'm going to go find out what it is before I spend any more time trying to rewrite this story. And thankfully, not long after that, a couple of months later, I stumbled across an article on someone else's site that Larry had written all about structure. I read it. It blew my mind. I literally read it 15 times. It was just oh my God, this was the biggest epiphany I'd ever had in my writing life. And I went through the bio, found his blog and, have been hooked ever since. So I'm really lucky because I found Larry in the very beginning when he first got online and started sharing all of this stuff. I actually had the opportunity to learn about structure through an ebook that he wrote that ended up becoming story engineering. And that was a year later. So it's just really cool to see, how things have transitioned. But the core is still that piece of structure. That was the thing that changed everything for me. And honestly, when I learned about it, I just remember looking back at all the years up to that point that I had been working on stories, because I've been writing stories, pretty much my whole life, but really seriously since I was 11, 12 years old. So I looked back on 13 years and went, oh my God, I didn't know this information, and all the classes I took, all the books I read, no one ever talked about it, or they didn't talk about it in a way that made sense to me. I remember my teachers in college saying a story must have a beginning, middle, and an end. So you've probably heard this too, the 3-act structure, the idea of a story has to have 3 parts, a beginning, a middle, and an end. That is so misleading, and not because it's intentionally misleading. They're not trying to say, well, I'm not going to tell you how to write this. It's because they don't know how to explain it. So they tell you need a beginning, middle, and end, or you need a 3-act structure. And then writers try to use that without knowing that there is more to it than that. So it's actually a disservice to not go deeper and teach what those 3 acts are really all about. So for me, I thought, well, okay, I've got 3 acts. I have a beginning, I have a middle, I have an end. None of it went together. It wasn't really cohesive, but I thought I had it, because I had a beginning, a middle, and an end. So that was my journey with structure. And when I learned it, it was the day I will never forget it. I don't remember the exact date, but I remember I was sitting on my couch. I was living in Texas at the time. I had this ebook in front of me and the article that I'd read from Larry. And I just remember sitting there being like, holy shit, this is the moment that's going to change everything. And I made it my mission in that moment to not only master craft, to learn it, to do whatever I had to do to study it, but also to teach it to other writers. And even though I was in the beginning stages of learning it, I just felt like no one talks about this shit. No one talks about it. And it's so important. It needs to be talked about. So I, joined Larry in the mission of sharing this stuff with the world, because it needs to be out there and more people need to know about it, because this is the thing that is going to save your writing career. It is going to make your writing career. It's going to give you a writing career, something that you wouldn't have without this thing. All right, so enough of the soapbox. And to get into the details of structure, Larry talks about structure being the big picture of a story. So it's really, how a story unfolds, the pacing of it, the way that the antagonist comes in, the setting of the stakes, the journey, giving the reader something to root for when they're seeing this character in action, and all of that. And it's a really big thing, and it really can be the difference between getting you published and not. So I had a client a couple of years ago who I helped write a book. She, came to me after 3 tries where she just couldn't make it work. And we wrote from scratch. She started with a brand new idea, and I helped her plan it out and figure out the structure and all of that. Within a year, she got herself an agent who is now shopping that book to publishers. So structure makes that big of a difference. And it really can be that easy when you know structure. Same thing happened to my father-in-law. He got this great idea for a story one day. He started writing it. He didn't really know what he was doing, but he just knew that he had this idea. When I found out about this, I sent him story engineering. I said, read this book. It will change everything for you. It's going to cut 13 plus years. So I had, 13 years of my life where I didn't know that structure existed. So I'm saying to him, this is going to cut years off your learning curve. It's going to help you actually create a story, and faster than you would trying to do it on your own without knowing this information. And so he read the book, redid his story based on what he learned from Larry, and he got published. So now his book's on Amazon. He's got with a traditional publisher. It's a small press, but it's a traditional publisher. So that really does make the biggest difference. And let's see, we had some comments coming through. Let me just go back through. Let's see. Shonda says, recalls to mind Poe's essay on how he wrote poetry. I call BS. That's funny. Corey, it's annoying when Writer's Digest does stuff like that. Yeah, exactly. Because they're supposed to be the authority in storytelling, and the fact that they do things the way they do sometimes just, it shocks me. I actually had to stop subscribing because it was starting to annoy me too much. It's possible to, Larry saying, it's possible to know in your gut structure. It's like writing, playing music by ear, only no training. They call that a prodigy. Are we prodigies? I hope you are. Not me, though. There is too much to know about structure to leave it to intuition. Once we learn it, though, intuition is empowered, then it can soar. Exactly. And that was exactly what happened to me. So 5 years of studying structure, studying story, practicing, working on my own stories, watching tons of movies, reading books, I finally have an intuitive sense of story. So now structure comes to me when I get an idea. A lot of times the structure just sort of plays itself out in my mind. It's like, okay, I get this idea for a story, boom, I've got my first plot point. And then it sort of just falls from there. And it's only because I've studied it so much and paid attention so much to how it works that I was able to have this sense. But I did not have this sense from the beginning. I mean, when I was writing as a young kid, yeah, I sort of had that intuitive, I knew there was something that had to happen at the story. I knew there had to be 3 changes, but I couldn't have explained it to you, and I couldn't have told you how I did what I did. So when I tried to replicate it, 10 years after the fact, I couldn't, because I didn't remember what I did to make it work the first time. So now that I know that stuff, it changes everything. It makes a huge difference. Shonda, no one breaks it down to simple parts. It's all couched in the romance of writing. No simple mechanics and to the point info. Exactly. And that's why I love story engineering, because it breaks it down in such a specific way. And we're going to get into that in about 5 seconds. Let me just finish going through these comments real quick. Corey, yes, that's what I learned in high school. Caused me to put off my writing for about 15 years. Yeah, seriously. Because it feels like a struggle. And then you feel like, I must not be cut out for this because I clearly don't know what I'm doing and I can't make it work. And you start making it on you when really it's not you necessarily. It's just that you haven't been given the information that you need to actually make it work. And so most writing teachers, they mean well. They're not trying to harm anybody. They're not trying to throw you off course. They just don't understand it enough to explain it well enough. So when I was in, I'd already been out of college and all of that. I actually was living in Texas, and my husband was going to school. He was going to sort of like take a few classes here and there. And so I took a fiction class with him. And that was the only professor I ever had who talked about the hero's journey. Now, at that point, I had already been reading story engineering, had known all that stuff. So I was in the class being like, man, this guy needs a medal because he's the best fiction teacher I've ever had in person, because he actually explained the hero's journey and he talked about it. And even though he wasn't 100% accurate with everything he was saying, it was the closest thing I had heard to structure than any other class I'd ever been in. So it was amazing just to see that there are some people out there who do know what they're doing. They just maybe can't explain it as well as Larry does. All right, Shonda. Yes, Larry gives epiphany. Ironic that today is January 6th. Tanya, exactly. It's like a light bulb went off in my head and coursed down through my fingertips finally when I came across Larry and Jennifer. Awesome. Larry, the trouble with beginning, middle, and end, there's no criteria for any of those parts, no defined mission with specificity, nor a means of transitioning between them. Yet that information exists. It is the key to enlightened storytelling. Yes. And Larry says, I'm not overselling this point. She's spot on. Yeah, I'm probably overselling a little because I'm super passionate about it. So I like to just kind of make sure you get that this is what matters. But yeah, I mean, it really is that important. It really does make the biggest difference. All right, I'm going to read a couple more comments and then I'm going to go back to actually talking about the stuff for the discussion. Laura, one thing I'm not clear about is that there should be about 10% of story before the inciting incident, but other advice is to jump into the action as soon as possible. Okay, well, we're going to get into that more over the next couple of days, but I would say the 10% thing is, they're talking about the setup. So they're saying your story is going to have setup, and then at 10%, something is going to happen that incites what actually comes through in the first plot point. Now, jumping into the action doesn't necessarily mean jump right to your first plot point. It doesn't mean that. It just means think about your story. Where's the furthest point you can start into the story that's close enough to the first plot point, but still far enough away that gives us setup, that can give us stakes, that can give us enough of an empathy for this character that by the time that does happen, we're already on board. We're ready to see this story. We're ready to root for them. Jumping into the action can mean, okay, well, if you're starting with two scenes, like for example, I'm working with someone right now who's writing a story, and the first scene he wanted to have a character who is he's a doctor, and he basically the opening scene was an ER story. So he has these characters, he's sort of talking to this lady in the ER, and then a little ways into the scene, they bring in this like trauma victim who now has to jump into action and start taking control on. So I suggested, rather than starting with this character who he's just talking to this lady and he's asking her about her pills and stuff and kind of boring and slow, to just skip that part and jump right into the action of, the ER trauma thing where he has to now jump in and start saving this person. That isn't really the story. That's just the opening scene, but it's jumping into the action of the scene rather than starting at a part where we don't need to see all of it. We're just jumping into the action, but it's not the action of the actual story that's coming at the first plot point. And that's really the difference. And Larry would probably have more to add to that. Sean, as a recovering I think you mean English major, discovering story structure and mechanics was a revelation. Absolutely. Absolutely, without a doubt, hands down, completely agree. Larry, the good news, once we know it, it's hard to find a good book, a published book that doesn't align with these principles, even from books written by instinct, writers who decree the very structure they end up with. Larry, actually, it's more like 20% before the first plot point, an act one inciting incident, yes, but the first plot point is the key inciting incident no matter what happens before. Yeah, exactly. So your first plot point, and again, we're talking about this more specifically tomorrow in the actual structure, but 20 to 25% in is your first plot point. If you have something that incites that beforehand, then it would be a little before, but it would still be considered setup for that moment and not really an inciting incident by itself. So, and Larry says, it's all set up prior to the first plot point. Even when it's huge, the first plot point has specific mission-driven criteria, a job to do. Exactly. And let's, with that, jump right into talking about the 4 parts of story. So, you probably heard of the phrase story architecture. And Larry talked about this in story engineering, the idea of there is actually a difference between story structure and story architecture. So to just sort of read that difference, rather than try to read my own handwriting, I actually wrote the page number down from the book. So in the book, page 138, he has a really, really powerful paragraph that explains the difference that I think just makes it so clear on what it is you need to know about your story. So he says, story structure is the sequence of your scenes that result in a story well told. Story architecture is the empowerment of those scenes through compelling characterizations, powerful thematic intentions, a fresh and intriguing conceptual engine, and a writing voice that brings it all to life with personality and energy. So structure itself is not enough, but it is the building block of creating a story and of finding what has to happen in between. So maybe you can, agree with this and maybe you feel this way. So if you do, definitely say yes in the comments if you have ever experienced this. You sat down to write a story. You know what you need to have in the beginning. You know how you want it to end. But it's that middle part that's all fuzzy for you. You're sort of like, I don't know what to write in the middle. How many times have you gotten stuck in the middle of your story? Share in the comments if that's ever happened to you. So you've written, let's say 25,000 words, and then all of a sudden you're stuck. I don't know where to go from here. I don't know what to do. And the reason that happens And that's happened to me. That was exactly why my first novel sucked, because I didn't know what to do. I got lost. I had no idea what was happening. So other than the main pieces that I had, I didn't know what to do in between that. So I just started writing random things that didn't actually add to the story. And that's what I see all the time with writers, is they've got some sort of a plot going on. It's just buried in all these random scenes that don't really do anything for the story. And Tanya says, yes, lost a few good computers out the window because of it. That's hilarious. Laura, yes, the freaking middle. Absolutely, exactly. So the biggest factor here is one simple thing, and that is context. So when you know the context of the parts of the story, it makes the biggest difference, because now you're not just saying it's a 3-act structure with the beginning, middle, and end, but each of those parts actually has a breakdown of a context to help you understand not only what it means, but also how to use it. So again, you've probably heard of the 3-act structure. Movies and plays use the 3-act structure a lot of times. Movies definitely, plays a lot of times do as well, depending. Sometimes they're like 2 acts and things like that. But movies are always 3 acts. So you've got your first act, which sets everything up. You have act 2, which is really a big section of the story. And then you've got act 3, which is your resolution. Well, the problem with that is that middle section, they say, that act 2, it's misleading to think that it's one thing, because it's not one thing. It's actually 2 things. And that's why I love Larry's version. And this is why I think that I've resonated so much with it, and why I've, understood it and actually been able to use it, is because he breaks it down so much deeper than that. So it isn't just 3 things. It's not just a beginning, middle, and end, because that middle has 2 pieces to it. So getting into that, it's actually a 4-act structure. And so I like to talk about it as a 4-act structure like Larry does, because it makes the most sense this way. Not saying you can't call it a 3-act structure, because you still can. It's the same context in all of that. It's just, it's not as clear. And that's why I think talking about it as a 4-act structure makes more sense, because then it breaks that middle section into 2 specific contexts, which help you identify, oh, this is what has to happen here, versus, oh, I have to write something in the middle. I don't know. Because really, if you think about it, that middle piece, that's most of your story. The beginning is setup. The end is how it gets resolved. But what the hell happens in the middle is the story. That's the story. So without knowing what's going to happen in that middle section, you're not going to be able to create a good story. That's really what it takes. So breaking it down into the 4 parts, part 1 is setup. So this is when you are setting up what is coming in the story at your first plot point, which is officially the start of part 2 of the middle section of the middle act of your story. So you're setting everything up. You're getting us ready for what's coming. Then part 2 is reaction. So now we're going into the 2-act structure, but we're splitting it into 2 sections. So it's actually 4. So that middle section is going to be part 2, which is reaction, and then part 3, which is attack. And there is a plot point right in the middle that divides those 2 things. As a 3-act structure, it's very hard to see that, which is why I love the 4-act version, because you can see that. You see not only the plot points, but you see the context in the middle that shows you the difference in what the character is doing in all of that. So they're not doing the same thing all through Act 2. It changes based on that middle plot point, which we'll get into more tomorrow. And then there's part 3, attack. And then, of course, your part 4, which is your resolution. That's where we wrap up the story. We save the day. We overcome the antagonist, the inner demons, and all of that. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. So Larry talks about, in story engineering, mission-driven storytelling. So the idea of everything has a purpose. It has a mission. It has a goal. It's not just there for the hell of it. It's not just there to give us characterization or backstory. It's there because it does something. It moves the story forward. It adds some sort of a context or mission into that scene. So going into the missions of these 4 parts of story, part 1 mission is to set up your plot by creating stakes, giving us the backstory, giving us characterization, enough of it so that by the time we get to that, first plot point, we actually empathize with this character. We care about them. We don't necessarily have to like them, but we care about them. We care about their journey, and we care about what they're going to be going through now that the first plot point has been introduced. And then, of course, in part 1, you're foreshadowing a lot of the conflict or the stuff that's coming in the story. So, and we'll talk about foreshadowing right at the end of this session. Really, really important topic. But yeah, so part 1 is all your setup. It's getting us ready for what's coming at the first plot point. Now, that's not to say you want to give us a ton of backstory or a ton of information that doesn't really need to be there. It's still mission driven. So each scene is setting up what's coming. So you really have to ask yourself, does this set up the story? Is there too much backstory? Is there enough of an actual story going on, or is this just characterization? Because that's another thing I see a lot of times with writers is they've got a lot of characterization and backstory, but there's nothing actually going on in the scene that makes it a goal or makes it a purpose that actually moves it forward. So you don't want that. You want your characterization and your foreshadowing and your backstory to layer in to scenes that actually have a mission, that actually move the story forward in some way. So don't just have them separate just to have the information there. All right, and then we get into part 2. So the mission of part 2 for our reaction phase is to have a protagonist reacting to the first plot point. This reaction is going to cause a new quest, a new goal possibly. It's going to introduce stakes or raise stakes on a goal that's already in play. It's going to cause any obstacles or things that are happening with the antagonist to get introduced to us. And again, I'm specifically not talking about the details of the plot points because we're going to be talking about that tomorrow. That's why I split up this section 5 into 2 parts, because I think without understanding the 4 parts of story and the context, it almost doesn't, not that it doesn't matter about the structure, but I feel like you kind of have to have both discussions and then merge them together. So that's why we're talking about the 4 parts of story today. And then tomorrow we're going to talk about the specifics of the story structure, the milestones, the mission of each one, and all of that. So once you've got your part 2 done, so that's reaction. So we see your character reacting to the first plot point, to whatever was introduced that now is their new journey, their new mission, their new goal. Then we hit part 3. The midpoint is what separates part 2 from part 3. So if you're in a 2-act or a 3-act structure, act 2 is split by midpoint, with part 2 of that, act 2 being reaction, and part 2 of that 2-act being attack, which is why I like the 4-act, because it gets confusing to say part 2 splits into 2 parts. And I just think 4-act is easier. It makes more sense. So once you're in part 3, this is, the mission here is attack. So this is when your character is able to start attacking the problem, start overcoming the inner demon slightly, start taking proactive action. So I would say, think of part 2 as reaction and part 3 as proactive action. So part 2 will still have action in it. It's just not, the context of that action is not attack. The context of it is reaction. And that's a key distinction here that you really want to keep in mind. And watch a movie and watch this unfold, and you'll see the character doesn't start taking action right away. They might actually be acting and taking action, but it's not action that's going to get them anywhere yet. So it's sort of reactive to whatever's going on, and they're trying to find their ground again. They're trying to find their footing again, but they're not ready to proactively take action. In part 3, they can be proactive. This is when they're able to really take action to start overcoming everything, to fight against the antagonist and whatever else they have to do that they haven't been doing up to this point. And then, of course, we have part 4, which is separated by the second plot point. So second plot point splits part 3 from part 4, or the second act from the third act if you're talking 3-act structure. And you get into part 4 mission, which is to resolve the story. So this is when we're going to save the day. We're going to overcome the antagonist. We're going to defeat him. We're going to achieve our goal, or not. Sometimes characters doesn't achieve their goal, but they still overcome the inner demons. That's the biggest part of it, and it sort of plays into, the character arc, which we talked about yesterday and the day before. So in this 4-part structure of a story, or the 4 parts of a story, the character also has a very specific context that they play in each of those 4 parts. So part 1 we said was setup. This is when we're setting up what's coming in your story. Your character is an orphan. Now, I talked about this in the other live stream, but just sort of to tie it together with the structure, character is orphan. So they haven't been adopted by a story. A story hasn't come into play. There's no opposition in the story yet. This is just the character's life in the moment. Once the first plot point hits, we get opposition to the character's goal in the story, either changes the goal or raises the stakes on the goal. And now we're into part 2, where the character is reacting as the wanderer. So they're wandering around trying to figure out what to do now. They're not sure what to do. And then we get the midpoint, which separates the part 2 from part 3 and is the catalyst for the character going from a wanderer to a warrior. So now they're in part 3 where they're taking action, they're attacking, they're the warrior. So they're actually able to step up and do things differently than they were up until this point. And then we have part 4, which is separated by the second plot point, and it is the catalyst for the character to become the martyr, which is when they are willing to do anything, whatever it takes to resolve the story, to overcome the bad guy, even if they have to die. Now, we know most of the time they don't die, but it could happen. So in Cruel Intentions, like I explained in the story, or in the character arc live stream, he died. He died in the story, but he overcame the antagonist. He defeated the inner demon. He saved the girl. He saved the day. and, all of that happened, even if he died. So he became the martyr for real. But they don't have to die. They just have to become someone who's willing to risk it all, to go all in, to do whatever it takes. That's what they need to do. And that makes them, into part 4, resolving the story and being the martyr. And of course, earning that hero title, which they deserve now that they've overcome everything that you put them through in the story. So that's how character arc plays along with the 4 parts of story. And again, there are 6 specific milestones that you're going to want in your story. And just to give a quick rundown, so you have a hook, you have a first plot point, you have a pinch point 1, midpoint, pinch point 2, and second plot point, which I will be getting into much more detail on tomorrow when we read the next section of part 5, which we're doing from the first plot point to the end of the section. So that's what our reading is for tomorrow. Let's see, there's been a whole bunch of comments since I was talking through that, so let me just go back through. Larry, structure is the weight-bearing foundation from which it all hangs. Architecture is the end and beauty shot that end up on the cover of a brochure. Now, that's a really good way of looking at it. I like that. Janet, I was about 50,000 words into my first novel, and then it started going off the rails. Story structure got me back on track and helped me keep the tension up. Took 6 years to write the 50,000 words and 72 days to write the next 42,000, thanks to the structure guidance. Still have a long way to go, but having much more fun than ever before. Absolutely. I know a lot of people complain about structure because they think it's formulaic. Oh, it's so formulaic. I don't want my story to have a formula. But the thing is, structure doesn't give you a formulaic story. It gives you a framework to write within so that you're not sitting down and going, what do I write now? I don't know what to write now. Or you're not sitting at a blank page staring. Like, people talk about writer's block. I don't believe in writer's block. I think writer's block is just a lack of knowledge of craft. Because if you know craft, you know what has to happen. There are no questions, so there is no writer's block. It's all about knowing the context and knowing what has to happen in the story in order for that to not be a block for you. So if you have writer's block, this could be why. It could be because you haven't learned enough about storytelling to actually know what has to happen in the story. So that's why I love structure, because for me, it was like, oh, that's what has to happen. So now automatically I know, well, this doesn't work because it doesn't fit the structure, or, this does work because it does fit. So it's very easy to know, what has to go in your story once you understand structure and understand the mission and the context of the parts of story and the missions of the specific milestones. It makes a huge difference. And so there is no, writer's block at that point because you know what to do. Larry, or 4 parts versus 3 acts, which when overlaid fits perfectly. Act 2 is broken in half, resulting in 4 parts, not 3. Exactly. And I know that screenplay, people like to talk about it in 3 acts. I still like to break it down in 4 because I just think it just makes so much more sense. And especially when you watch a movie and you can really pay attention to that middle section where we get the first plot point, we see the character, being reactive, we get the midpoint, something changes the direction that causes them to now be proactive. You can see it unfold. You can really see it happen. And it's amazing because when you see that, you can't unsee it. You can't unsee, the way that it works. And you'll notice it over and over and over again in everything you read and everything that you watch. And suddenly it will just hit you. This is how you tell a story. And the greatest part is that when you think about the structure and you think about the missions of each part of the story, and then look at all the movies that are out there and all the books that are out there. Are they formulaic? Do any of them even have exactly the same stuff going on? Of course not, because different people wrote them from a different creative mind, from a different way of thinking. So it's never going to be formulaic. What it's doing is giving you a framework. So it's like, and he talked about in story engineering, it's like a blueprint. So an architect is not going to go to a building site and then just start digging holes and stuff. They're going to actually have a plan specifically built out to know how big everything has to be and how long and how tall and how whatever, because if they don't do that, the building's not going to stand up properly. It's going to be lopsided. It may not pass inspection because it doesn't hold up properly. So it's not about being formulaic. I mean, look at all the buildings out there. I mean, other than if you live in like a subdivision where all the houses look exactly the same, they're not formulaic. People take this idea of building something and they use that knowledge to design it how they imagine it. And it's the same thing with a story. So if you've ever felt like structure is formulaic, this is your opportunity to really understand it so you can see how it works and really understand that it is not formulaic in any way. It gives you creativity. And to me, I love the idea of it because I think you could look at a blank page forever and not know what to write, or you could understand the principles of structure and of storytelling And suddenly it gives you this creative license to just go crazy within the confines of that structure. And creative people, I know creative people are like, I don't like to be in a box. I don't want structure. I don't want formula. But the thing is with being creative, creativity is like crazy. So you have to rein it in. You have to give it something to act within. And so by having parameters, or by having, so like people talked about the other day in the live stream about having like different prompts and things for stories that they write. So they write for competitions, they give you a prompt. They say, this is, what the story has to be about. Well, that right there is giving you a box to work within. And then you add structure to it and it just brings it to life. Whereas if you just go, oh, I've got this random page and I don't know what to write. Well, that's the thing that's going to stop you from being able to come up with a good story. And not to analyze this to death or to give more metaphors, but I think another way to look at it, and I say this a lot because my dog is a big part of my life, so I talk about him a lot. But when I take my dog out to go potty, if I don't hold the leash locked so that he has only a certain distance that he can go, he will just run around for 20 minutes trying to find a spot to go to the bathroom. But if I lock the leash so he can only go within a certain distance, he goes faster, he gets it done faster, and he gets, back in the house faster. Same thing with structure. You could run around for years trying to write a story, but if you lock yourself into, this is the parameters that my story needs to fit in, and this is the structure that's going to make it come to life, well, now you've given yourself a framework to not be out running around for years trying to find your story, but you're actually building it based on principles that are in play in every story. Shonda, great analogy. Oh, thank you. It's not normally wouldn't want to talk about your dog going to the bathroom probably, but I just thought that every time I see him do that, it just makes me laugh because I think of story, and maybe it's just because my mind is always thinking about story, but watching him run around just for 20 minutes drives me nuts. Whereas if I lock the leash and he can't go that far, he knows that he can't go that far. So he has to pick a spot within that little circle that he's in, and that's it. And it just makes it easier. Let's see. Hope. I like the metaphor Larry uses in the book to explain the difference between structure and architecture. Exactly. Yeah. And definitely reread that section if you haven't read it yet, everybody, because it's a really, really good distinction that I think is super important to know, because once you understand it, you automatically, again, it changes everything. It just becomes this knowledge that you have that all these other writers out there don't have, and they have the opportunity to learn it. It's just that they're not willing to, or they haven't got to that point where they're so frustrated that they're ready to quit. So I think sometimes we have to be pushed to that point of like, I can't do this anymore. And that's what happened to me. I wrote my same story 2-3 times before I was just like, I can't do this anymore. Like, if I have to write the same story over this many times, I'm going to stop writing fiction. I'm going to do something else in my life because it's too frustrating to me. So now I have a very in-depth planning process, which yes, does take me quite a bit of time. But when I write my first draft, that's the only full draft I write. Once I do revision, I might be tearing apart some of the scenes, but mostly it's the same story. It's just changing maybe how I'm wording it, or I might have another idea of how to make it work better, but the story is still the same. So I'm not rewriting the whole draft. I'm just revising it based on the story that's already there. And for me, that has made the biggest difference. That is absolutely the only reason I have a story published at this time. That's the only reason I've got my second one in revisions at the moment. Like, that would never happen, a few years ago when I didn't have this process and when I didn't understand what it really takes to write a good story. Let's see. Hope says, I saw the 4-part structure as I watched Northern Lights by Nora Roberts on Lifetime Network this morning. Yeah, exactly. And the more you start watching movies and understanding this stuff, the more it's going to come to life at you, and the more it's going to jump off the screen. And it's perfect when that happens, because once you can see it, you can't unsee it. And it just becomes something that you recognize, oh, that's the first plot point. Oh, that's the midpoint. Oh, this is the context where they're wandering around or whatever. So really, really important thing. Hope, which of his books does Larry recommend we read to see story structure in action? Well, he gives some really great stuff in this book. If you haven't already read that section, definitely read the section on the actual structure points, which, like I said, is for tomorrow. So part 5 from page 173 all the way to page, let's see. All the way to page 226 is your structure stuff. And in there, he gives breakdowns of several stories. And I'm going to tomorrow give you a breakdown of a really good story as well, so you can see the structure sort of played out. But the best way is to just go to his website, look at the deconstructions that he's done, because he's done hundreds of them, and hundreds of pieces of, several stories. So breaking them all down, not just, oh, here's the story, but really he has like a series of these for like The Help and an education, and let's see, he's got one for, I'm trying to think of all the ones he's done, Hunger Games, tons of them. I also think Story Fix, his newest book, also has breakdowns of 2 full stories in there as well. So I would check those out for sure. Larry, he answered for you. I've deconstructed 12 novels on my site. Actually, once you know it, you'll see it in pretty much every story. For example, The Girl on the Train, The Help, The Hunger Games, The Da Vinci Code, Avatar, Shutter Island, and anything by anyone who understands the stuff or uses it without being able to label it. Larry, great point about first drafts. They don't have to suck. Exactly. They don't have to suck, but they will suck if you don't do enough planning ahead of time and development of your story ahead of time, because then your draft is not a draft. It's a mission in finding your story. So you're sort of journeying along, writing this, draft to find your story, but you don't have your story yet. So that's why you end up writing multiple drafts. That's why it ends up taking years of your life. And for me, that is a no-go. That is a no-go because I am somebody who likes fast-paced. I'm someone who likes to get stuff done and move on to the next thing. And if something is going to take me years and years of my time, I'm most likely not going to do it. So that's why, for me, having the story plan, developing it ahead of time, planning it out, and then writing it has changed everything for my writing life. Janet, Larry has some published deconstructions available through Amazon as well, so worth the whopping $2.99. Yeah, absolutely. Corey, I get so frustrated. I even loaned my coveted story engineering out to my writing friends, and they don't read it. Yet they don't feel confident in their writing, and they don't know why. It kills me. Seriously. But you know what? They'll get there, because the whole thing is, there is a, and I've talked about this in a couple of blog posts, and I don't know if I can remember the terms that I used, but I basically described it as 3 parts of the story journey, which is, the first is oblivious dream. So you're in this dream, you think, I'm going to be a New York Times bestselling novelist, my books are going to get turned into movies, blah, 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 all these big dreams that you have, but you're totally oblivious to the fact that you don't know what the hell you're doing. And until you get to that point where you've accepted it and said, okay, it's time. I don't know what I'm doing and I'm ready to accept that and learn what it really takes. Well, you're still going to stay in that oblivious dream phase until when you finally get it. Oh, there's something to this. There's craft. There's whatever. Then they're going to get into phase 2, which is the backtrack, I call it, because now you've written for all these years, but now you're backtracking and learning what it really takes to write a good story. So really you should do that first before you spend years of your life working on a story. But not everyone wants to do it that way. So now you're backtracking, you're learning what it really takes. And then once you've learned enough and mastered enough of it, you can move to phase 3, which is now we're getting somewhere. Now you know what it takes. Now you can really take that idea in your head and bring it to life on the page and be able to explain why it works. So, stick with them, keep prodding them with the story engineering thing, because eventually they will get to that point. You're either going to get to the point of frustration and you're going to say, I've got to do something different, or you're going to quit. And that's it. That's really, I think, what it comes down to once you hit that wall of, I can't do this anymore. I don't know what I'm doing. That's just my opinion. Okay, Larry. Hope, sorry, didn't see the his in your question. Have you seen the master graphic that sums it up? I can post it on one of Jennifer's venues. I bet she has it. Yeah, if you want to put the link in the comments of this live feed, then actually everyone can get it from there. Larry, a draft can become a search tool. We just need to understand that's what it is. Even then, applying the structural principles will make that work. Yeah, exactly. Hope, I haven't seen Master Graphic. Please post it. Thanks. Loan, come on, insert grin here. Yeah, I buy this book for people. So I probably sent this book to like at least a dozen people at this time, maybe even more at that, because it's just so important. And I can't loan a copy because I always got to have my own copy. And even though I've read it a million times and I've pretty much memorized the whole friggin' thing, I still will not give up my copy of it. So I won't loan it. Mine is marked up. It's highlighted. It's got circles. It's got notes. Everything. I will never give up my copy of this book. But I buy copies for people because I definitely believe they need to read it. So, all right, I'm going to wrap up this discussion by talking about one more quick thing, which is foreshadowing. There's a ton to know about foreshadowing, and honestly, I can't even get into all of it probably, and there's so much. But the biggest thing about foreshadowing, and I would say the biggest place in your story where foreshadowing actually shows up, is in part 1. So in your setup phase, this is when we're getting the most foreshadowing, because this is when you're really able to leave hints at what's coming, foreshadow, things that are going to happen in the story later, give us hints at conflict, give us hints at just little things that are going to happen. really, really cool thing is if you watch a movie and you watch the setup of it and pay attention to all the foreshadowing. So a lot of times you have to have seen the movie in order to know that it's foreshadowing, obviously. But once you've seen a movie all the way through, go back and watch the first part, because there is something really cool just getting to see how movies show you foreshadowing. So one of my favorite ones, and I can't remember the movie, it was an Adam Sandler. I talk about Adam Sandler movies a lot. I'm a 90s child, so Adam Sandler was like the, funny man of my generation. So I love his movies, but he had one with Jennifer Aniston probably a decade ago called Just Go With It. And I loved some of the foreshadowing in the beginning of that one because it was so subtle, and yet if you could literally glance over it and not even realize it was foreshadowing until later. So they showed he had a ring, a wedding ring that was in his pocket, and he took it off and he put it in his pocket. So he had the wedding ring and put it in his pocket. Well, he forgot that he did that, but it was a really key thing to show us because this guy was making up the fact that he was married. He's not actually married, and he used that as a way of like getting women. And so he took it off and he put it in his pocket thinking he was done for the day or whatever. And then he meets this girl and they're having a great time. He's starting to fall for her. And then she finds the ring and thinks he's married. So it was great foreshadowing because all the camera did was just pan real close on the ring for like 3 seconds. And then it went to the next scene. Not a big deal. Until later, when you start to see like, oh, that ring is going to get him in serious trouble with this girl and cause all these other things to go on. So this foreshadowing is such a fun little thing. But the most important key about foreshadowing is that you can't use it properly if you don't know your story. And especially if you don't know how your story is going to end. Because when you know the end, when you know everything that has to unfold and you've developed it enough, you can actually look for places. Where can I put foreshadowing in? Where can I hint at little things that are coming? So in a story, and the more you watch movies and read books and pay attention, you'll start to see this. There are no random things that happen in a story. If it comes through in the story, it's because it's going to show up later. There's going to be some sort of a wraparound. It's an open loop that's going to close later. A lot of stories I see from new writers will just have tons of open loops, but nothing closes. It's just this happens and then never gets mentioned again. That is the worst thing you can do. Don't do that because that makes it a random piece that has nothing to do with the story. If it's there, it has to be there because it actually does something for the story. It adds something, it foreshadows something, it hints at something, whatever. And I was watching a movie the other day, a really cheesy girl movie from the 90s. Actually, it might have been from 2000s, but it was a Britney Spears movie. She did this movie. And the only reason I was watching it is because I know that it had good structure. And so I wanted to just sort of see how it unfolded. And so I was watching it. And it's cool because there's hints early on. This girl is pregnant and she talks about the fact that this guy raped her, that it wasn't just that she was a slut, but she actually, like everyone thought. So they were sort of telling her, oh, she's so bad and she got pregnant and all these things, but no one knew what really happened. And so she mentioned it, but she didn't tell us who did it. But we know that there's something to it. And one of the other girls is dating this guy who only comes home at Christmas time. And this girl's story was talking about the fact that this rape happened at Christmas time. And so all of a sudden you just start picking up on these little hints that the guy who did this to her is this other girl's boyfriend. And you don't know it till the end of the movie, but the hints were there all along. They could not have done that if they didn't know where it was heading. And that's why you plan your story. That's why you develop your story. That's why you do this, because then you can really set up foreshadowing in a way that makes the reader go, oh my God, that's why they showed us that. Like, to me, foreshadowing is one of the best parts of watching a movie or reading a story, because you get these little hints and you don't know what they mean at first, but you just know they mean something. And then all of a sudden it unfolds and you're like, man, that's why they did that. So cool. Like, and maybe it's because I'm a story nerd and I just love storytelling. So I find it to be really cool. But yeah, so I'll be in a theater going, that's why they did that. And like, because I'm crazy, but I love storytelling and I love the way foreshadowing works in a story. So that was everything from this part 1 of section 5 of this book that we're going to talk about today. If anyone has questions, put them in the comments so that we can, me and Larry can answer them for you. And I'm going to wrap this up. Like I said, for tomorrow, and yes, tomorrow is Saturday. I know I am doing a live stream on Saturday and on Sunday. There will be recording, so if you can't be here live, don't worry. You can come back and check out the replay after. The replays are always live immediately after the live version is ended. We are reading the rest of part 5. So we read today up until foreshadowing. So starting for tomorrow, we are reading the most important moment in your story all the way to the end of part 5, which is going to give us the more specific details and breakdown of the story structure, the specific milestones, and what the mission of all of them is, which we will get back to talking to tomorrow. All right, last chance for comments, questions, anything you want to add to the discussion, put it in the comments now, or if you're watching this as a replay, put them in, because everyone's been coming back and checking them out. I've been checking them out afterwards, so more than happy to give you info. Let's see. Sean, I've got both the physical and Kindle versions. Yeah, me too. I have the physical versions of all his books and his Kindle books as well, because I like to keep them with me. So if I have my Kindle, I've got all my books with me. I don't have to worry about it. And then I've actually got a little special bookshelf that's on, and I can actually show it to you guys if you want to see it. I have a little special bookshelf right here just for Larry's books. And normally Story Engineering would be right here, but obviously I'm reading it right now, so it's out. But yeah, so and then I've got my novel here, which is alive and real because of all of Larry's books. I've got my other bookshelf here, but I keep his special because they mean much to me. They're just, to me, and I know that this is going to sound cheesy, but I credit him almost with the fact that I have a writing career, the fact that I know how to tell stories, the fact that I have a business teaching people how to write stories and helping them develop their ideas. Like, none of that would have happened if I hadn't found him, if I hadn't learned about structure from him, and if it hadn't changed my life as much as it did. So I'm sort of a nerd in that way, but I like to just sort of keep those separate because I like to see them and to know that they're there and I can grab them at any time and start reading them. And then they just remind me of how far I've come and just to remind me that, like, I did this, I made it happen, and it's because of what I learned from Larry. So yeah, I've got lots of copies of his books. Shonda, yes, me too, both copies. Yeah, awesome. Larry just sent the graphic to Jen via email for her to post. Don't have a specific URL since it's within my training programs and post. Okay, cool. I will figure out how to get it out here for everybody. Thanks, Larry. All right. Wrapping this up, guys. Thank you so much for joining me. Larry says the structure graphic. Oh, okay. He linked to the structure graphic in the comments. So if anyone wants to check that out, go and check that link out right there. Thank you so much for joining me for this discussion. I'm super passionate about structure and I can't wait to talk tomorrow about the details of the specific story milestones. So have a great night and read section 5 from the most important moment in your story onto the end of section 5. And we will come back tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern to talk about it on the live stream. Catch you next time.